A family vanished in 1972, and 52 years later, a sealed room was discovered in their house. That's the line that rattled around every newsroom, every living room, every whispered conversation the day the story broke. A family gone without a trace, then decades later, a locked chamber buried behind brick and plaster, a mystery frozen in time, suddenly thawed out by accident. The house had been standing there all along, a skeleton of another era. For most people in town, it was just background, something you drove past without thinking. The kind of place kids dared each other to approach on Halloween, where weeds grew waist-high and windows sagged like tired eyes. People said the house watched you, even when it was empty. They said it held its breath. By 2024, the property had been sold for cheap, passed off to a small crew of contractors who saw nothing more than a fixer-upper. They came with their tool belts, their buckets of joint compound, their portable radio crackling with classic rock. It was another job, another paycheck. No one expected to stumble onto history. It happened in the basement. Basements already carry a kind of unease, don't they? The air, colder, thicker. Every creak of wood above you becomes a footstep in your imagination. The light bulbs never seem bright enough, no matter how many watts they promise on the box. The foreman sent 2 men down to clear out old shelving. The beams of their flashlights swept across concrete walls and water stains, spiderwebs glinting like threads of silver. One of them swung his hammer at a corner panel that looked swollen with moisture. The thud didn't sound right. It wasn't solid. It was hollow. At first, they shrugged. Plenty of houses had cut corners in construction. They figured it was a shoddy patch job, maybe a storage crawl space. But when they peeled away the plaster, their hammers striking harder, they realized the wall wasn't part of the original build. Bricks stacked neatly, sealing something off. They looked at each other, the air tightening in their lungs. Who builds a wall inside their basement floor to ceiling with no door? It took hours to break through. Dust rose in clouds so thick it stung their throats. The sound of brick collapsing echoed through the empty house like thunder. They joked nervously, trading theories. Maybe it was Prohibition-era bootlegging. Maybe someone hid valuables. Maybe, though they said it half laughing, maybe it was hiding something darker. By the time the opening was wide enough to crawl through, the jokes had stopped. The first thing that hit them was the smell. It wasn't the sharp mildew of an old basement or the sour stink of mold. This was metallic, cloying, the way pennies taste when you press them to your tongue. A smell of air that hadn't been touched in half a century, a smell that made their stomachs twist before they even saw what lay inside. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams sweeping over the hidden chamber. The space was larger than they expected, like a whole room deliberately erased from the house's design. The walls were bare, but someone had lived here. That much was clear. A table sat in the center with 4 chairs tucked neatly around it, as if waiting for a meal that never came. A child's toy car rested on the floor, its tiny wheels long rusted but its red paint still catching a glint of light. Against one wall was a dresser, its drawers closed but its top littered with family photographs in cracked frames. Smiling faces, frozen in time, watching the intruders with the kind of warmth that felt eerie in such a place. And then, in the far corner, half buried under a collapse of plaster and debris, lay bones. The crew fell silent. Their flashlights trembled. No one dared speak, as if words would wake the dead. The bones weren't scattered like an accident. They were curled, tucked against the corner, as though someone had laid there for a very long time. One worker swore he saw more. Shadows shaped like smaller bodies, forms slumped against the wall. He dropped his light and scrambled backward, out of the hole, gasping. The foreman grabbed his phone, fumbling to dial. His voice cracked when he reached the dispatcher. He could barely form the words. "We found something. We found people." Within the hour, the place was swarming. Patrol cars parked at crooked angles, red and blue lights washing over peeling paint and broken shutters. Detectives in plain clothes, crime scene technicians in white suits, neighbors clustering on sidewalks with hands over their mouths. For a house that had been forgotten for decades, it suddenly became the center of gravity for the entire town. And from the very first whispers, from the moment the first neighbor pressed close enough to ask what had been found, the same name came up again and again. The Reddick family. Everyone knew the story, or at least thought they did. In 1972, James and Margaret Reddick, along with their 2 children, vanished from this very house. One day they were here, living their ordinary lives, and the next they were gone. No goodbye letters, no signs of forced entry, no trace at all. The police searched, the town speculated, but the case dried up like rain on hot pavement. Flyers with their faces once clung to telephone poles until the paper yellowed. Search parties once trampled the woods until the trails grew back over. Candlelight vigils once lit the night until the candles burned out. And eventually, the story became just that, a story, a ghost tale for the next generation. But standing outside that house in 2024, watching men in gloves and masks carry evidence bags into the night, the town realized this was no campfire story. This was real. And something unspeakable had been hiding here all along. The reporters said the house was giving up its secrets, but the truth was darker. The house had been keeping its secrets. And now, 52 years later, the walls could no longer hold them. But to understand how we got here, to understand who the Reddicks were and what they meant to this quiet town before everything went wrong, we need to go back. Back to the summer of 1972, when the house was still alive with laughter, when the Reddick children played in the yard, when Margaret hung laundry in the sun, and James waved to the neighbors on his way to work. Back to before the silence, back to before the vanishing. To understand what was found inside that hidden room, we need to understand the people who once called this house their home. The Reddicks weren't famous. They weren't rich or notorious. They were ordinary, and that's what makes the story so haunting. Because ordinary people aren't supposed to just disappear. Ordinary families don't just evaporate into thin air. James Reddick was 38 in the summer of 1972. He worked at the local paper mill, the kind of job that stained his clothes with pulp and ink, no matter how many times Margaret washed them. He was a steady man, not flashy, not given to temper. Neighbors remembered him as polite, a little quiet, the sort of man who tipped his hat when he walked by and always kept his yard trimmed. He liked baseball, fishing on the weekends, and the radio crackling with news on his drive to work. Margaret, his wife, was 36. Where James was quiet, Margaret was warmth in motion. She sang while she hung laundry on the line, hummed while she cooked dinner, and filled the house with little touches of care. Family photographs lined the hallway, children's drawings covered the fridge. She had a garden out back where she grew tomatoes, and she always sent the neighbors home with baskets when the harvest came in. People said she had a way of making you feel like family even if you'd just met her. They had 2 children, Emily, 8 years old, all freckles and missing teeth, a whirlwind of chatter and questions. She loved to draw, loved to tell long rambling stories about fairies and secret kingdoms. She carried around a stuffed rabbit with one floppy ear that never left her side, even when it was threadbare and patched. Then there was Daniel, only 5, bright-eyed, curious, the kind of child who tugged at everyone's sleeves until they laughed. He adored toy cars, pushing them across the kitchen floor with little vroom-vroom noises. When he got excited, his words tumbled out too fast to understand, but his joy was contagious. Together, the Reddicks looked like the picture of suburban life in the early 1970s. They had their routines, their rituals. James left for the mill each morning at 6:30 sharp, coffee in a thermos, lunch packed in a brown bag. Margaret walked Emily to school, Daniel's small hand clasped in hers, before heading to the market or the library. In the evenings, they ate dinner at the table, a habit Margaret insisted on. No TV, no distractions, just family. On weekends, James mowed the lawn while Margaret clipped coupons at the kitchen table. Emily rode her bike up and down the street, training wheels rattling, while Daniel trailed behind, always a little slower, always calling for her to wait. In a town where gossip traveled faster than the wind, the Reddicks didn't give people much to talk about. They seemed, to everyone who knew them, stable. But stability can be deceptive. The Reddick house itself was part of their identity. Built in the late 1950s, it was a modest 2-story, white siding, dark shutters. A wide porch with a swing where Margaret liked to sit in the evenings with a glass of sweet tea. The basement, cool and shadowy, stored canned goods and jars of preserves. The attic smelled of cedar and mothballs, filled with boxes of Christmas ornaments and outgrown clothes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. And yet, for as ordinary as the family seemed, people remembered little details that now, in hindsight, feel like puzzle pieces. One neighbor swore James had been more distracted that summer, staring off at nothing when he thought no one was looking. Another said Margaret had started locking the doors even in broad daylight, something she'd never done before. There were whispers that James had gotten into some kind of argument at work, that he'd been seen with a man in a dark car a few weeks before the disappearance. But back then, those were just passing observations, nothing anyone thought much about. Only later did they take on weight. Emily had a school friend who recalled that, in their last week together, Emily drew darker pictures than usual. Houses with no windows, people with no faces. When the friend asked why, Emily only shrugged. And Daniel sweet babbling, Daniel told the neighbor across the street that there was a man in the basement. The neighbor laughed it off as childhood imagination. Kids say strange things after all. But decades later, that line would echo like a curse. Still, in 1972, the Reddicks were just another family. Their lives may have carried undercurrents no one fully saw, but on the surface, they were ordinary, happy, stable. Which is why, when they vanished, it shook the town so deeply. Because if a family like the Reddicks could disappear, then no one was safe. The summer of their disappearance was hot, the kind of sweltering heat that made tempers short and nights restless. Ice cream melted too quickly, fans spun endlessly, and kids ran barefoot through sprinklers. The Reddick children spent afternoons chasing fireflies, their laughter carrying into the humid air. Margaret hung laundry on the line, sweat beading on her forehead, while James came home later than usual, his shirt collar damp, his eyes tired. No one knew it then, but those little snapshots, Emily's drawings, Daniel's toy cars scattered on the porch, Margaret's tomatoes ripening in the garden, were the last glimpses of the family's ordinary life. Because by the end of that summer, the Reddicks would be gone. And the only thing they would leave behind was silence. The last day the Reddicks were seen alive was a Saturday, July 22nd, 1972. A day that should have faded into the background of summer, remembered only for heat waves shimmering over asphalt and the lazy hum of cicadas. But instead, it became a day people in town would retell for decades, each neighbor replaying their memories like reels of old film, searching for clues they missed the first time. The morning began unremarkably. James Reddick woke early, as he always did, but instead of working his full shift at the paper mill, he came home before noon. A coworker later recalled how James seemed distracted that day, checking the clock too often, his brow furrowed as if he was counting down to something. He left with barely a word, driving off in his battered Ford while the rest of the men wiped their brows and carried on with the grind. At the Reddick house, Margaret was busy in the kitchen. She had a rhythm to her, Saturdays cleaning in the morning, baking in the afternoon, and getting the kids settled so she could prepare a proper dinner once James was home. That day, she was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour, when Emily and Daniel plopped down nearby with crayons and scraps of paper. The fan rattled in the window, pushing out hot air that smelled faintly of yeast and soap. The family's life was ordinary, in the way that makes memory both vivid and haunting. Neighbors remembered the sound of the lawnmower sputtering to life around 1 o'clock, James pushing it in wide arcs, while sweat darkened the back of his shirt. They remembered Margaret bending in the garden, clipping roses with a pair of rusted shears, her hair tied back in a scarf. Emily circled the block on her bike, waving and laughing, her freckles bright against sunburned skin. Daniel followed with his toy car clutched in one hand, struggling to keep up. To anyone watching, it was a picture of normalcy, a family tending their lives on a sweltering Saturday. But small details stood out, details no one thought to question until later. One neighbor swore Margaret kept glancing toward the street that day, standing on the porch with her arms folded, her eyes narrowed as if she were waiting for someone. When the neighbor waved, Margaret waved back, but her smile was stiff, hesitant. Another recalled that James didn't stop to chat with anyone while mowing, unusual for a man who always offered at least a polite nod. He kept his head down, pushing forward, his movements sharper than usual. The strangeness deepened that evening. Around 7, James lit the backyard grill, smoke drifting into the heavy air. The smell of burgers and charred corn mingled with the distant strum of a guitar from a neighbor's porch. Fireflies blinked across the lawn, and for a while it looked like any summer evening in the neighborhood. But then the phone rang. Margaret answered. A neighbor with her windows open said she heard the faint shrill of the ring, then Margaret's voice, clipped and tense. She couldn't make out the words, but at one point Margaret's tone rose sharply, like she was startled or upset. James came inside, closing the door, and the rest of the conversation was lost to the walls of the house. That was the moment people would later circle back to, the phone call, the change in tone, Who was on the other end, and what did they say? The last confirmed sighting of the Reddicks was between 9 and 9:30 that night. The porch light was on. Emily's bike leaned against the steps, its handlebars tilted, while Daniel's toy car lay abandoned on the walkway. Normally, Margaret never let the kids leave things outside overnight, but perhaps the heat had worn her down, or perhaps she was distracted. Either way, the objects remained. Small relics of playtime abruptly ended. After that, the house went quiet. Lights dimmed, windows darkened. Neighbors went to bed with fans whirring and screens rattling in the humid night air. No one heard a scream. No one saw a car pull up. No one noticed anything unusual. Silence had a way of disguising itself as safety. By morning, though, silence became sinister. The Petersons next door noticed first. They were up early, drinking coffee on their porch, when they realized Margaret's laundry was still hanging on the line, stiff with dew. Margaret never left laundry overnight. She was meticulous, almost proud of her domestic rituals. The Petersons thought perhaps she had been distracted, but when they glanced again hours later, the clothes were still there, limp in the breeze. By mid-morning, another neighbor noticed James's car still in the driveway. He should have been at work by then, boots on, thermos in hand, but the car hadn't moved. The blinds were drawn, and the house was silent. Around 11 o'clock, the Petersons walked over and knocked. Once, twice. The sound echoed without answer. They knocked louder, calling Margaret's name, calling James's. Nothing. They peered through the windows. What they saw made their stomachs knot. The kitchen table was set for breakfast. Bowls and spoons laid out, a loaf of bread half sliced. The chairs tucked neatly under the table, as if waiting for the family to sit down. On the couch lay Emily's stuffed rabbit, its one floppy ear askew, staring blankly at the ceiling. James's work boots sat by the door, ready to be slipped on. Everything in its place, everything suggesting routine, but no family. By afternoon, the police were called. Officers entered through the back door, which was unlocked. They moved carefully through the house, their voices low. Every room was neat, every bed made. The children's toys lay scattered where they had been left. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood, nothing to suggest violence, just a family that had vanished. The basement was checked too. Officers descended with flashlights, the beams bouncing off concrete walls. They found shelves of preserves, dusty jars lined up in rows. A faint draft carried the damp smell of mildew. The walls looked ordinary, solid. No one tapped them, no one measured them, no one guessed that a false wall stood quietly, holding secrets just feet away. The hidden chamber would remain undisturbed for 52 more years. That night, patrol cars lined the street, their headlights sweeping across porches. Officers stood in small clusters, smoking and murmuring. Neighbors gathered outside, arms folded, children clinging to their sides, eyes wide with fear. Theories sparked quickly. Maybe the Reddicks had been kidnapped. Maybe they'd run away. Maybe it was something stranger. But when morning came again, and the Reddick house still stood empty, it became clear that this was no misunderstanding. The family had vanished. And the only witnesses were the little details left behind. A half-sliced loaf of bread, a bike on the porch, a toy car in the grass, and a phone call no one could explain. It was the last night anyone ever saw the Reddick family alive. By Sunday evening, July 23, 1972, Maple Lane no longer felt like just another quiet suburban street. The Reddick house had become something different, something heavier. The blinds were drawn, the porch light, once a beacon of warmth, glared into emptiness. The breakfast table sat waiting for mouths that never came. The police tried to reassure people. Their first statements to the press were calm, measured, almost dismissive. They told reporters that there was no clear sign of foul play, and that the family may have left town voluntarily. In 1972, the idea of an entire family walking out of their lives seemed unlikely, but not impossible. Maybe James had landed a new job in another state. Maybe they'd decided to visit relatives without telling anyone. Maybe they wanted a fresh start. But the neighbors weren't buying it. They knew the Reddicks. Margaret didn't leave wet laundry on the line. James didn't abandon his job at the mill. Emily didn't go anywhere without her stuffed rabbit. Daniel didn't leave his toy cars lying out. The details were too wrong. By Monday morning, word of the family's disappearance spread like fire. The Petersons, who had been the first to knock on the door, told their story to friends at the diner. By lunchtime, it was being whispered over counter stools. murmured across grocery aisles, and repeated in pews during church. The words carried weight. The whole family's gone. And once those words left the neighborhood, they didn't stop. The town's only newspaper printed the headline on Tuesday: "Local family missing without a trace." A black and white photo of James, Margaret, Emily, and Daniel smiling in their Sunday best stared from the front page. The article was short, factual, little more than a police statement and a timeline. But the image made it real. 4 faces staring back, 4 lives hanging in limbo. By midweek, the police response escalated. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions. They wanted to know if anyone had heard strange noises, seen unusual cars, noticed anyone lurking near the Reddick home. They asked if anyone knew of enemies, debts, affairs. The neighbors had plenty to say. One woman swore she had seen a black sedan parked down the street 2 nights before, a man inside smoking cigarettes. Another insisted she had heard raised voices coming from the Reddick house the night before they vanished. Others admitted they had noticed nothing at all, and their guilt at not paying closer attention gnawed at them for decades after. The police checked James's work records at the mill. He had no write-ups, no complaints, nothing suggesting trouble. They checked the bank. No sudden withdrawals. They checked the mail. No threats, no ransom notes, no goodbyes. The only thing that stood out was the phone call, the one Margaret answered on that final night, her voice sharp, her tone uneasy. But in 1972, phone records weren't like they are today. Local calls left no paper trail. Whoever had been on the other end was invisible. The following Saturday, a week after the disappearance, the town came together for the first major search. It was blistering hot, the sun baking the fields and woods. Volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder, stretching across meadows and down trails. Dogs sniffed the ground, handlers calling commands. The sheriff's department borrowed a helicopter to scan from the air, its rotors beating the silence into submission. People combed the riverbank, eyes scanning for clothing, for footprints, for anything. Mothers carried sandwiches in paper bags, handing them out to tired searchers. Teenagers lit candles at the church, praying for the children. Men from the mill trudged with heavy boots through the woods, sweat stinging their eyes, refusing to stop until night fell. But nothing was found. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not even tire tracks leading away. The second week, hope began to fray. Rumors replaced facts. At the grocery store, people whispered that James had owed money to dangerous men. At the post office, someone claimed Margaret had been seen with a stranger in a dark car. At church, there were hushed theories of cults, kidnappers, even UFOs. Every person seemed to have their own version of the story, their own explanation for the unexplainable. The police tried to keep up. They chased tips, but every lead went cold. They interviewed coworkers, school friends, distant relatives. They dredged ponds and creeks. They checked bus stations and airports. Nothing. By the third week, the media descended. Reporters from nearby cities drove into town, cameras in tow. They knocked on doors, asking for quotes, shoving microphones into faces. The story of the vanished family was splashed across television screens and printed in papers miles away. "Family vanishes in suburbia," the headlines blared. No clues, no bodies, no trace. The Reddick house became a backdrop for nightly news. Cameras panned over the white siding, the porch swing swaying in the summer breeze, the overgrown roses in the yard. Commentators speculated, their voices solemn, their theories wild. Some treated it as tragedy, others as spectacle. The town felt invaded. But the worst part was the fear. By August, the easy comfort of the town was gone. Parents who once let their children roam the neighborhood until dark now kept them inside. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades were now bolted shut. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Even friends eyed each other differently, wondering if someone knew more than they were saying. The Reddick case had no center, no explanation, no closure. And when you strip a community of answers, you leave only paranoia behind. The police continued to insist they were following every lead, but inside the department, officers admitted to each other that they were lost. They had no suspects, no crime scene, no timeline beyond the vaguest of details. They were chasing shadows. And the house itself sat there, silent and still. The blinds drawn, the porch light off, the breakfast dishes still waiting. Officers had walked through it dozens of times, searching for anything. But they never looked behind the walls. They never tapped on the bricks in the basement. They never wondered if the answers were closer than they dared imagine. For the town, the Reddicks had vanished into thin air, and for 52 years, that was the story people told themselves. But thin air doesn't keep secrets. Brick and plaster do. The official search for the Reddicks began with urgency, the kind of urgency that carries the illusion of certainty. Officers believed that if they moved fast enough, if they covered enough ground, they would find something. Because families don't just disappear. Families leave footprints, tire marks, scraps of clothing, sightings at bus stations. Families can be traced. The first coordinated effort began on Wednesday, 3 days after the Petersons knocked on the door and found silence inside. Dozens of volunteers gathered outside the Reddick house that morning, dressed in jeans and work boots, their faces set with determination. The sheriff, a stout man named Harold Briggs, stood on the porch and gave instructions. They would search in grids. They would cover the woods, the riverbank, the fields. They would leave no stone unturned. People fanned out in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, walking slowly through the brush. Some carried sticks to poke at undergrowth. Others whistled for dogs. Every now and then, someone would call out, the group pausing in hope, only to realize it was nothing a scrap of paper, a pile of leaves, an animal track. The river was searched next. Men in boats dragged hooks along the muddy bottom, their eyes squinting against the sun, looking for shapes beneath the surface. Women lined the banks, shielding their eyes, holding their breath each time something snagged. But nothing surfaced. Only branches, weeds, and silence. Day after day, the search expanded. Farmers opened their barns, letting police check the haylofts. Hunters led officers through deer trails in the woods. Even the old quarry was searched, its stagnant water reflecting the summer sky. But every effort ended the same way, empty-handed. The sheriff tried to keep morale high. "We'll find them," he said, his voice gravelly from cigarettes and exhaustion, but his eyes betrayed doubt. He had been in law enforcement for 20 years, and he knew the longer a family remained missing, the slimmer the chances of finding them alive. The community's hope began to fracture. At first, people brought sandwiches and cold drinks to the searchers, cheering them on. But by the second week, when nothing was found, the casseroles stopped coming. The vigils grew smaller, whispers grew louder. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said James had gotten into trouble with the mob, that he'd borrowed money he couldn't repay, and the whole family had been taken as punishment. Others claimed Margaret had fallen for another man, that she had run off with him and taken the children, leaving James behind, or perhaps James had discovered the affair and killed them all before disappearing himself. There were wilder theories, too. Theories whispered in hushed voices at the grocery store, half-believed but impossible to ignore, that the Reddicks had been taken by a cult, that they had been abducted by strangers passing through, even that they had been taken by something not of this world. The police, meanwhile, were drowning in tips. Every day brought new calls, new letters, new people swearing they had seen the family at a gas station, or a bus terminal, or a roadside diner. Officers chased each one, driving hours to interview waitresses and motel clerks. Every single lead dissolved into nothing. The most promising lead came from a man who claimed he had given a ride to a woman and 2 children along the highway the week the Reddicks disappeared. He swore the woman matched Margaret's description and that the little girl had freckles. The man said they asked to be dropped off near a rest stop. But when police pressed for details, his story unraveled. He couldn't remember the exact date. He couldn't remember the color of the car he had been driving. Some officers believed he wanted the attention. Others wondered if he wanted to insert himself into the case. Either way, the lead went nowhere. The investigation took its toll on the police as well. Detectives spent nights at the station, their desks cluttered with photographs, maps, and notes. One officer admitted years later that he dreamed of the Reddicks almost every night that summer. Margaret staring from the porch, Emily's stuffed rabbit sitting alone on the couch, Daniel's toy car rolling across the floor without a hand to push it. The longer the search went on, the stranger the house itself began to feel. Officers returned again and again, walking through its rooms, hoping they'd miss something. They opened drawers, flipped mattresses, pried open floorboards. They found nothing unusual, just a house caught in mid-motion, as though time had stopped. Still, a few details gnawed at them. The breakfast table, set for a meal that was never eaten, the unlocked door, the missing phone records, and the eerie neatness of it all. If the family had been taken by force, why was nothing disturbed? If they had left on their own, why had they left everything behind? By the end of July, the case had begun to feel less like a search and more like a haunting. People still walked the woods and riverbanks, but they no longer expected to find the Reddicks alive. What they expected, if anything, was to find bodies. But no bodies came, no evidence came, just silence. The search had begun with urgency. Now it was dragging under the weight of unanswered questions. The town was caught between grief and dread, each day blurring into the next, every whisper feeding the mystery. And all the while the house sat there, silent, waiting, its walls holding secrets no one thought to question. When days turned to weeks, and weeks bled into months with no sign of the Reddicks, something shifted in the town. At first there had been hope, then worry, then despair. But once the official search began to dry up, once the headlines grew fewer and the reporters packed up their cameras, there was something else left behind. Whispers. People whispered everywhere. In line at the grocery store, in pews at Sunday service, over cups of coffee at the diner. They whispered because they needed answers, and when answers didn't come, they made their own. One of the first theories to take hold was money. James had been a steady worker at the mill, but some said steady wasn't enough. The early 70s had been hard on the town, prices rising, wages stretched thin. Maybe James had borrowed money from the wrong people. Maybe he had gotten caught in something bigger than himself. When no debt records turned up, the rumor simply shifted. Maybe it wasn't money owed on paper. Maybe it was cash borrowed in back rooms, handshakes in dark parking lots. Others turned their attention to Margaret. She was well-liked, warm, always ready with a basket of tomatoes from her garden, but whispers have a way of twisting even kindness. Some swore she had been seen talking to a man no one recognized at the market a few weeks before the disappearance. A tall man in a dark car. Had she been planning to leave James? Had she taken the children and run away with someone new? That theory collapsed under the weight of reality. Margaret hadn't touched the family's savings. She hadn't packed clothes, hadn't taken Emily's stuffed rabbit or Daniel's toy cars. What kind of mother runs away without the things her children can't sleep without? Then came the darker theories. Some said the Reddicks had been murdered, maybe by a drifter, maybe by someone in town, maybe even by James himself. The neatness of the house, the breakfast table set, the beds made became its own kind of evidence. People whispered that it felt staged, too perfect, like a scene scrubbed clean. Perhaps James had snapped, killed his wife and children, and buried them somewhere. Perhaps he had fled afterward, unable to live with himself. But if that were true, why was James never seen again either? How could one man erase not just his family but himself, leaving no trace? Theories piled on top of theories, and none of them fit, which made space for even wilder ones. The town had always had its share of superstitions. Old farmers spoke of curses on the land, stories passed down from their grandparents. Stories of shadows in the woods, of cries heard near the quarry at night, of lights in the sky. In the absence of answers, people turned to those stories again. Some swore they'd seen strange lights above the tree line the week the Reddicks disappeared. Others said Emily's drawings in school, those faceless people, those houses with no windows, were warnings. A few whispered that Daniel's odd comment about the man in the basement hadn't been imagination at all. As the case grew colder, more unusual characters inserted themselves. A psychic from 2 towns over came forward, claiming she had visions of the Reddicks near water. Police humored her at first, leading another fruitless search along the river. A preacher declared the family's disappearance a punishment, a test of faith for the community. Some believed him, others turned away, tired of divine explanations for earthly pain. Even within the police department, theories swirled. One detective was convinced James had been involved in something criminal, though he never found proof. Another believed they had been kidnapped by someone they knew, someone close enough to be invited inside without a fight. Others believed the family had been taken far from town, that they were long gone before anyone even noticed they were missing. But no theory ever stuck. Every idea frayed under scrutiny, falling apart the moment details were examined. And yet, the whispers didn't stop. They grew, mutated, passed down through years until the Reddicks were less a family and more a legend. By autumn, the house stood empty, its garden choked with weeds, laundry still hanging stiff on the line until the wind tore it away. The longer it sat vacant, the more the stories grew. Children dared each other to run up to the porch, to peek through the windows. Some swore they saw figures moving inside, even though the power had been cut. Others swore they heard noises at night, footsteps, the faint ring of a phone, a child's laughter carried on the wind. The house became more than a house. It became a symbol, a reminder of how fragile normal life could be, a place where answers should have been, but weren't. And beneath all the whispers, one truth lingered. The Reddicks hadn't just vanished, they had been hidden. It would take 52 years for that truth to come out. But in 1972, all anyone had were whispers. Time has a way of dulling sharp edges, but it never erases them. In the years after the Reddicks vanished, the case shifted from a crisis to a ghost story. At first, there were still searches, still meetings at the sheriff's office, still flyers pinned to bulletin boards. But slowly, the urgency drained away. The volunteers stopped showing up. The dogs stopped combing the woods. The headlines shrank from the front page to small blurbs buried in the local paper. Eventually, even those disappeared. By 1975, 3 years after the disappearance, the house on Maple Lane had been standing empty long enough for the paint to peel. Weeds choked the garden where Margaret had once grown tomatoes. The porch swing hung crooked, rust eating at its chains. The blinds stayed drawn. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the front door, then sprint away, their hearts pounding. To them, it wasn't the Reddick house anymore. It was the haunted house. For the Reddicks' extended family, though, there was nothing haunted about it. There was just grief. James's parents, already elderly when the family vanished, died within a decade, still waiting for answers. Margaret's sister moved out of state, unable to drive past the empty house without breaking down. Cousins grew up carrying the weight of the story without really knowing the people inside it. Every year, on the anniversary, a few people still gathered at the church. They lit candles, they prayed, they said the names: James, Margaret, Emily, and Daniel. The gatherings were small, quiet. Some years only 1 or 2 people came, but they came all the same. For the town, the case became part of its folklore. New families who moved in heard the story whispered by neighbors. Children grew up daring each other to peek in the windows. Teenagers snuck into the backyard at night, swearing they heard voices. Parents warned their kids not to go near the place, but of course, warnings only made it more tempting. Detectives changed, sheriffs retired, but the Reddick case sat on shelves in dusty folders. Every once in a while, a new officer would pull the file, flip through the yellowing pages, and try to find something everyone else had missed, but nothing ever surfaced. It became what police call a cold case, but cold doesn't capture the weight of it. Cold suggests absence, emptiness. The Reddick case wasn't empty, it was heavy. Too heavy to move forward, too heavy to let go. For those who had lived through it, life moved on, but never entirely. Neighbors admitted years later that they locked their doors for the first time after the Reddicks disappeared, and they never went back to leaving them open. Parents held their children closer. The town never fully shook the unease. The hardest part, people said, was the ordinary details. Margaret's laundry left stiff on the line, Emily's rabbit abandoned on the couch, the bread half sliced on the kitchen table. It wasn't just that the family was gone. It was that they had vanished mid-routine, as if someone had hit pause on their lives. That image never left people. It haunted them in ways a crime scene might not have. And so the years dragged on. By the 80s, the Reddick case was something told at sleepovers, whispered in school hallways. By the 90s, it was brought up on the rare occasion a journalist did a retrospective. By the 2000s, it was mostly forgotten, except by the few who could never let it go. The Petersons, the neighbors who had first knocked on the door, moved away in the early 80s. They said the memories were too heavy, that they could never look at the house without thinking of that morning when no one answered. Others in the neighborhood grew old and passed away, taking their recollections with them. But some couldn't let it rest. A retired detective kept clippings in a shoebox, rereading them every anniversary. Margaret's sister called the sheriff's office once a year, even decades later, asking if there was any news, and each time, she was told the same thing: no. The town grew, changed, modernized, but the house on Maple Lane remained a scar. It went through phases: sold, resold, left vacant. Some owners tried to renovate, but most didn't last long. They said the house felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. Some swore they heard knocking in the walls. By the time 50 years had passed, the Reddicks were less a family and more a legend. People said their names with a kind of reverence, the way you say the names of people who belong to another time. Their photographs yellowed, their story blurred, their house decayed. And still, no one knew the truth. The silence lasted half a century, a silence broken only when workers, tearing down plaster and brick, stumbled into the sealed room beneath the house. But that moment was still decades away. For now, the Reddick family remained only a memory trapped in time, waiting for the walls to finally give way. By the late 1970s, just 5 years after the disappearance, the Reddick home was no longer thought of as the Reddick home. It was simply that house. The one parents warned their children about. The one teenagers dared each other to sneak into. The one real estate signs lingered in front of for months, sometimes years, with no serious buyers. At first, the town treated it like any other empty property. The grass grew high, the paint peeled, and someone was hired to maintain it just enough to keep it from looking abandoned. But even with the yard trimmed, even with the porch swept, the house seemed different. People said it felt heavy, as though the air around it pressed down. Children walking home from school crossed the street rather than pass too close. They whispered stories about the family who had vanished. They said you could still see faces in the windows if you looked long enough. They said the porch swing sometimes moved on its own, creaking slowly in the night breeze. Teenagers treated it as a dare. They crept up to the porch after dark, knocking on the door, some swearing they heard footsteps inside. A few slipped in through broken windows, their flashlights catching glimpses of the house's frozen state. The furniture still there, the wallpaper curling at the edges, dust coating everything. They dared each other to go into the basement, but most didn't last long. They said the air was different down there, heavier. Adults didn't talk about it much, but they avoided it all the same. Neighbors noticed lights flickering inside at odd hours, though the electricity had long been shut off. Some claimed they heard voices muffled, faint, like conversations through a wall. One neighbor swore she heard a child's laugh one evening, carried on the wind. She never walked past the house after that. The property changed hands a few times over the years. Every new owner seemed hopeful at first, promising renovations, plans to breathe life back into the place. But each attempt ended the same way. One couple in the 80s lasted less than 6 months. They moved out suddenly, telling neighbors the house was unsettling. When pressed, they admitted they had heard noises at night knocking in the walls, footsteps across the upstairs floor. A single man bought it in the 90s, intending to flip it for profit. He gutted some of the upstairs rooms, but when he reached the basement, he stopped. He told people the walls were wrong, that he felt watched while he worked. He abandoned the project, selling it at a loss. Over time, the house became less a home and more a symbol, a reminder of the unanswered questions, a reminder that 4 people had vanished and no one knew why. The weeds grew tall again, windows sagged, and the porch swing finally snapped from its chain. For the town, it was a scar that never healed. Some avoided driving down Maple Lane altogether. Others slowed their cars, staring at the hollow windows, daring themselves to look away. The house loomed large in local lore. Parents told their children not to wander near it. Children told each other stories of the man in the basement, of hidden rooms, of screams trapped in the walls. By the time 50 years had passed, the house felt almost alive. Not just a structure, but a presence, a thing that held onto its secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. And that moment would come in 2024, when a crew of workers, sledgehammers in hand, knocked against a hollow wall in the basement, when plaster crumbled and bricks gave way, when the house finally exhaled the secret it had been holding for half a century. But before that moment, for decades, the house simply waited, empty, watching, a monument to a family that had vanished, and a mystery that had never been solved. By the spring of 2024, the house on Maple Lane had been sitting empty for nearly a decade. Its shutters dangled by rusted hinges, weeds curled up the siding, and water stains spread like bruises across the ceilings. It was a shell, an old wound the town had stopped probing. That was when a small contracting company bought the property. To them, it was just another fixer-upper, a cheap house on a quiet street, a chance to gut the inside and flip it for profit. They didn't know the full story, at least not at first. Not every worker had grown up in town, and those who had mostly laughed off the old ghost tales. A family that vanished in the 70s? Creepy, sure, but nothing to lose sleep over. The crew showed up on a warm morning in May. Their boots thudded across the warped floorboards as they hauled in tools. They set up radios, cranked up music, and began the slow, dirty work of tearing the house apart. Sheetrock came down, pipes clanged, dust filled the air. They joked about the smell, about the age of the wiring, about how this dump will barely be worth the trouble. For a while, it was just another job, until one worker went down to the basement. Basements always feel different, and this one was no exception. The air was thick, colder than upstairs. The single bulb overhead swung gently as if disturbed, though no one had touched it. The man muttered under his breath, shining a flashlight as he moved shelving away from the far wall. That was when he noticed it. The wall didn't look quite right. The bricks didn't match the others around them. They were too neat, too uniform, as though someone had deliberately sealed something off. He tapped it with his hammer. Instead of the solid thud of concrete, the sound echoed hollow. At first, he laughed. "Hey, I think I found a secret stash," he called up the stairs. The others crowded down, shining their lights, knocking on the wall themselves. Jokes flew about bootleg liquor, hidden treasure, maybe even cash stuffed in old coffee cans. They were laughing when they raised their hammers. The laughter didn't last. It took hours to break through. Each strike sent dust billowing into the air, the workers coughing, sweat slick on their skin. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. It clung to their lungs, sour and metallic. By the time the opening was wide enough to crawl through, the mood had shifted. No one was laughing anymore. The first man pushed his flashlight through the gap. The beam cut into darkness, illuminating a room no one had known existed, a room sealed away for 52 years. The smell hit them first, a sour metallic stench, sharp and overwhelming, like rust and rot mixed with damp earth. The man gagged, stumbling back, covering his mouth with his sleeve. Another worker forced himself forward, shining the light into the hidden space. What they saw silenced them. It wasn't an empty room, it was furnished. A table stood in the center, 4 chairs tucked neatly around it. A dresser leaned against one wall, topped with cracked picture frames. A child's toy car lay on the floor, its red paint dulled but still visible. Everything coated in thick layers of dust, frozen in time. And in the far corner, half buried beneath a collapse of plaster and debris, were bones. The workers stared, unable to breathe. Human remains, one set, maybe more. The flashlight beam shook as it passed over the skull, the curve of ribs, the long reach of arm bones curled against the wall. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Finally, the foreman fumbled for his phone, his voice trembling as he called 911. We found something," he stammered. "We found people, in the basement, behind a wall." The dispatcher's questions blurred together. How many bodies? Whose house? How long had they been there? The foreman couldn't answer. He just kept repeating, "You need to get someone out here. Now." Within the hour, squad cars pulled up, lights flashing against the cracked siding of the house. Officers taped off the property, ushering the workers outside. Neighbors gathered at fences and sidewalks, eyes wide, voices hushed. Some were old enough to remember the flyers, the searches, the endless silence of 1972. They whispered the same name over and over, the Reddicks. Detectives arrived next, their flashlights cutting through the darkened house, their shoes crunching on old plaster. Crime scene technicians in white suits set up lights, cameras, evidence bags. For the first time in over 50 years, the Reddick house was alive with activity. The discovery spread fast. By the evening, news vans crowded the street. Cameras rolled as reporters stood against the backdrop of flashing lights, their voices solemn. "Breaking news tonight," one anchor said. "Human remains discovered in the long-abandoned Reddick home. This is the same property where a family of 4 vanished without a trace in 1972. Tonight, after half a century, investigators may finally be closer to answers." The town buzzed with shock. For decades, the Reddicks had been a story, a cautionary tale, a mystery without end. Now, for the first time, there was something tangible. Bones. A hidden room, a truth that had been walled off, waiting. But discovery is not the same as understanding. The sealed room raised more questions than it answered. Who built it? Why was it hidden? Whose bones lay inside? Were they all there, or only some? The house had finally given up its secret, but the darkness inside was only beginning to be revealed. When the dust settled literally, when the bricks and plaster had been hauled away, and the crime scene lights filled the basement, the sealed room revealed itself for what it was, not just a hidden chamber, but a time capsule. The air inside was stale, heavy with decay. Every surface was coated in a half-century of dust, yet nothing had been disturbed since the day the room was sealed. It was as though someone had pressed pause in 1972 and left it that way. Investigators began their work slowly, methodically. They photographed every inch of the space, the table with 4 chairs tucked neatly around it, the dresser with cracked picture frames, the toy car on the floor, the sheet that had once covered an armchair, now rotted through. But the bones drew the most attention. In the far corner, under collapsed plaster, technicians carefully brushed away debris. What they uncovered chilled even the most seasoned among them. Multiple sets of remains, small bones and large, adult skeletons and children's. The medical examiner was called in. She crouched over the bones, her gloved hands tracing along the brittle edges. She could tell immediately they had been there for decades. The decomposition was complete, the bones dry, stained from years against damp concrete, but the positioning told a story. The bodies hadn't been scattered. They weren't tossed carelessly. They were curled together, huddled almost, as though they had been lying there when the wall went up. Word spread fast. By the next morning, every newspaper, every television channel carried the headline, "Reddick Family Remains Found in Hidden Room." It wasn't confirmed yet, not officially, but everyone knew. The town's oldest wound had been reopened, and for the first time in 52 years, there was proof of what had happened. Proof that the Reddicks had never left. They had been here all along. The next step was to figure out how. Forensic teams worked around the clock. They gathered every scrap, bone fragments, hair, fabric fibers, even the dust itself. They tested the photographs from the dresser, hoping to pull fingerprints. They cataloged the dishes on the table, the chairs, the sheets. The medical examiner's early report was grim. All 4 skeletons appeared to be present, 2 adults, 2 children. The bones showed no obvious gunshot wounds, no knife marks. But there were subtle fractures, signs of blunt trauma. And something else, microscopic evidence of chemical residue in the marrow, possible poisoning. Investigators began to build theories. One possibility was carbon monoxide. The basement had an old furnace, and if the room had been sealed while it was running, the family could have suffocated. But the fractures suggested violence, not just poisoning. Another possibility was deliberate poisoning through food. The bread on the table, the dishes, could they have been laced with something? The most unsettling detail was the construction of the wall itself. Who built it, and when? Contractors estimated the bricks had been set quickly, sloppily in some spots, hurried as though the builder was racing against time. Mortar samples tested old, consistent with the 1970s. This wasn't added decades later. This had been built then, at the time of the disappearance. The conclusion was chilling. Someone had walled the Reddick family inside that room. Alive or dead, they had been hidden deliberately. Detectives dug back into the original files from 1972. They pored over interviews, notes, photographs. Theories that once seemed outlandish suddenly gained weight. The mysterious phone call Margaret answered on their last night. The neighbors who swore they saw her waiting on the porch for someone. Daniel's eerie remark about the man in the basement. Whoever he was, he had been close enough to enter their home, close enough for them not to fight, close enough to vanish them without a trace. For 52 years, the town believed the Reddicks had been taken away. Now, investigators realized the unthinkable truth. The family had never left their house at all. They had been entombed there, just feet away from where neighbors drank coffee, where kids rode bikes, where life carried on for decades above their hidden graves. The silence wasn't absence, it was concealment. And as the evidence mounted, detectives began to close in on the darkest possibility of all, that whoever sealed that wall had been someone the Reddicks knew. The truth did not come all at once. It came in fragments, sifted from dust and old records, stitched together by detectives who were too young to remember the original case, but determined to solve it. The first clue came from the wall itself. Forensic specialists examined the mortar, finding fingerprints pressed faintly into the drying cement. Time had eroded them, but modern technology pulled partial prints. They didn't match James, Margaret, or either of the children. They belonged to someone else. The prints were run through databases, At first, nothing. But then, a partial hit an old set of prints from the 1960s, connected to a man named Richard Hanlon. Hanlon had been a mason, a contractor who lived just a few streets away from the Reddicks in the early 70s. He was known in town, hired often for small construction jobs. Neighbors remembered him tall, broad-shouldered, with a reputation for being both charming and volatile. What most people didn't know, or chose to forget, was that Hanlon and James Reddick had clashed, not once, but several times. Digging through old mill records, detectives found notes of disputes between James and Hanlon, who occasionally did subcontracting for the company. Witnesses described shouting matches, accusations over money, over work, over pride, nothing that seemed criminal at the time. But in the shadow of the sealed room, those arguments took on a sinister cast. Then came the phone records. Though local calls in 1972 left little trace, detectives found something buried in the old phone company archives, a long-distance call placed to the Reddick house that night. The number was registered to none other than Richard Hanlon. The pieces began to align. Margaret's tense voice on the phone, the strange car seen outside, Daniel's remark about the man in the basement, the hurried construction of the wall, Hanlon's fingerprints in the mortar. Detectives interviewed Hanlon's surviving relatives. He had died in 1998, never charged with anything connected to the Reddicks. His children described him as a hard man, quick to anger, prone to disappearing for hours without explanation. One admitted, with hesitation, that the basement had always frightened them growing up. Their father kept tools down there, but also secrets. The motive was harder to pin down, but whispers from the past resurfaced. Some neighbors recalled that Hanlon had shown interest in Margaret, lingering too long in conversation, making comments that left her uncomfortable. Others said he resented James, that their arguments had turned personal. The working theory that emerged was chilling. On that hot July night in 1972, Hanlon had gone to the Reddick house. Perhaps he had lured them into the basement with some excuse, a repair, a concern, something only a neighbor and mason might know how to frame. Perhaps the family had followed, uneasy but trusting. What happened next was violence. Blunt trauma suggested a struggle. Chemical traces hinted at poison or fumes. Whether the family was dead or dying, Hanlon had done something unthinkable. He built a wall around them, bricked them into a tomb inside their own home. It explained the eerie neatness upstairs. The breakfast table set, the doors unlocked. Hanlon had wanted it to look as though they had simply vanished. He left the scene staged, while the truth lay sealed behind brick and mortar, just feet away. For 52 years, the town searched outward into the woods, the rivers, the highways. But the crime had never left the house. The monster wasn't a drifter, or the mob, or a cult. It was a neighbor, someone everyone knew, someone who waved from his yard, who drank coffee at the diner, who nodded politely at church. The revelation hit the community like a storm. For decades, people had whispered theories, accused strangers, even blamed the victims. Now the truth was clear. The Reddicks hadn't run away. They hadn't been taken by some shadowy force. They had been murdered by a man they likely knew well enough to trust. And worst of all, he had lived the rest of his life freely, carrying his secret to the grave. Detectives held a press conference, confirming the remains belonged to James, Margaret, Emily, and Daniel. They explained the evidence tying Richard Hanlon to the crime. They admitted, with no small measure of regret, that he was beyond the reach of justice. The town reacted with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that the mystery was finally solved, horror at the details. The image of the family sealed into a hidden room together, trapped, erased from sight, haunted everyone who heard it. The case was closed, but closure felt complicated. The truth was darker than any rumor, heavier than any myth. And though the Reddicks were finally at rest, the question lingered. How had no one known? How had no one heard the sound of bricks being laid, of a wall being built in the dead of night? The answers had been there all along. The house had tried to tell its story in creaks, in drafts, in the whispers of children daring each other to step inside. But no one had listened. Until 52 years later, when the walls finally spoke. The day the discovery was made official, the Reddicks were no longer a story, no longer a legend whispered in classrooms and at diner counters. They were a family again. At a press conference on the courthouse steps, the sheriff's voice cracked as he confirmed what many already knew. The remains found in the sealed room belonged to James, Margaret, Emily, and Daniel Reddick. DNA testing had matched with surviving relatives. For 52 years, the Reddicks had been hidden just beneath the surface of their own lives, walled away in silence. The announcement brought relief to some, heartbreak to others. For the Reddicks' surviving relatives, nieces, cousins, distant kin, it was the first answer in half a century. They held each other, some crying, some stunned into silence. "At least we can put them to rest now," one cousin said softly, though her eyes filled with tears. "At least they're not lost anymore." The town held a memorial service that week. Candles lined the church steps. Photographs of the family, James in his mill uniform, Margaret in her garden, Emily with her missing tooth grin, Daniel clutching his toy cars, were displayed at the front. People who hadn't spoken the Reddicks' names in years whispered them now with reverence. For the first time in 52 years, prayers weren't just for answers, they were for peace. But peace was complicated. The truth was dark. The family had been murdered by a man they trusted, a neighbor who lived among them, smiled at them, maybe even shared coffee with them. Richard Hanlon had carried the weight of that secret to his grave, and he would never face justice. That fact sat uneasily in the hearts of many. Closure without accountability can feel hollow. Yet there was some comfort in knowing the Reddicks hadn't abandoned their lives, hadn't chosen to disappear. They hadn't left their children's toys and laundry and breakfast table behind willingly. They had been taken, cruelly and unjustly, but they had never truly left. They had been there all along, waiting to be found. The house itself became a question mark. Some said it should be demolished, torn down so the ground could breathe again. Others argued it should stand as a memorial, a place to remember the family and the mystery that consumed generations. For weeks, debates filled the town council meetings. Neighbors split between erasing and preserving. In the end, the decision was made to tear it down. The house was bulldozed one bright morning in late summer, watched by a crowd of neighbors standing silently on the street. Dust rose into the sky as the walls fell, as the basement was filled, as the physical reminder of half a century of silence was erased. But erasing the house didn't erase the echoes. Even now, people still speak of the Reddicks in hushed tones. Some say the street feels lighter without the house looming there. Others say the silence feels even heavier now, as though something important was removed along with the bricks. And then there is the detail, one last haunting piece that has never been fully explained. When investigators cataloged the sealed room, among the dust and debris, they found a small notebook. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was Margaret's. Most of it was illegible, smeared by dampness and time. But on one page, scrawled hastily, were 6 words. "He's in the walls with us." Who she meant, no one knows. Perhaps it was Hanlon. Perhaps it was a metaphor written in panic. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. That single line has lingered like a chill in the town's memory, a reminder that even with the truth revealed, mysteries remain. The Reddicks were laid to rest together at last, their graves marked side by side. Flowers bloom there every summer, placed by strangers who never knew them, but who carry their story all the same. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, people walking past the empty lot where the house once stood swear they hear the faintest sounds. A child's laughter, a woman humming softly, the creak of a porch swing moving in the dark. The Reddicks may be gone, but Maple Lane will never forget them.